when investment goes down because the net investment, in other words, didn't keep up with the depreciation. So we might have a situation where there's a deep recession and companies are not replacing or upgrading their capital. And so the capital stock of the entire country has gone down because they didn't invest enough to pay the depreciation. So in other words, everything depreciated by 50 billion, but they only bought 30 billion. So in other words, the value of the capital stock went down across the country by 20 billion. That's an example. That's not a true story. It's an example of what could have happened. So sometimes when things are bad, we don't invest enough to rebuild the country, and everything wears down. That doesn't happen often, but net domestic product looks at how much new investment we have. Okay? So it's a little more accurate. This would be additions to what we have, whereas this would just be raw spending on investment. Now let's define things. I'm going to get rid of this net depreciation one. This is consumer spending, consumption. I need to say consumer because depreciation sometimes has the word consumption in its name. So consumer spending on goods and services. Investment is 3 different things. Believe it or not, new housing, if it gets counted, right? New housing. So even though it's business, this is considered business investment. If it's a new house, it's considered, or a new apartment complex, it's considered business investment. Okay, business spending. Oh, I just realized they've added a new one in the last couple years. I've got to add that. Net changes in, or let's just put changes in inventory. Change in inventory. And then research and development. Since 2013, they've added that expenses. Research and development, that's where they look at the costs of producing a new product. And you are designing something new that has value. And so the money spent on that, not in producing it, but in designing it, counts. Now, it didn't used to, okay? Change in inventories. Here's how this works. I tell you what, let's come back to that. Let's get the rest of this defined. This is government purchases not transfer payments. What's a transfer payment? If government gives somebody something who doesn't give them something in return, it's called a transfer payment. So, food stamps, that's an example. So you know, the government gives you something, you don't do anything in exchange, that's called a transfer payment. We don't count those here because we're wanting a measure of what's produced. So this is when government buys a Jeep or an airplane or a marker or something, and they get the marker in exchange, or the airplane in exchange, or the Jeep, or whatever. This is purchases of stuff, not government transfer payments, okay? Exports minus imports, this is net. Net means after subtractions, and gross means, well, it's just like your paycheck. the gross amount's always higher than the net. The net's what you get afterwards, right? So this is exports. This is imports. There you go, okay? So GDP is the sum of all of these things. Now let's go back to change in inventories, okay? If we're going to count what is produced this year, then we need to, in fact, I'm going to move over to a cleaner part of the board here so you can see. Let's just rotate this over. Okay? Okay. January 1, December 31. Okay? Let's say you had $10,000 worth of product in January 1 that was produced the previous year, and at the end of this year, the balance is 0. And let's also talk about the opposite. Let's say that it's 0 here and $10,000 here. Okay? This is measured actually from spending. GDP, I started to wave at the part you can't see anymore. GDP is in the product market, and they actually measure spending. So it's the total spending in today's dollars, on consumer products, business products, government purchases, and the difference between exports and imports. So that's spending. But sometimes you produce stuff that doesn't get spent, and sometimes there's stuff left over from the previous time that might have been counted as spending, but it was produced the previous year and counted the previous year. So let's say that all the other measures come up to, it's a small country, let's say $100,000 is the other GDP that we've got. Now, this change in inventory is going to go in here into GDP, but other than that, we got 100,000 that in spending we've counted. However, this was in inventory. Inventory, I hope you've had enough business to realize that what inventory is. Inventory is stuff that is being stored and you want to sell it, right? So this came in from the previous year. And was counted as spending by all the other parts of the GDP, okay? So basically, 10,000 of the money that was spent, and it was spent, can you see? Because there's none left at the end of the year. So we're going to have to subtract the amount that we had in January that doesn't show up in December, because that means basically the difference is what? The $10,000 amount that was produced in the beginning of the year. Excuse me, not produced. It was in inventory at the beginning of the year. So we're going to have to take the 100,000 that was sold in the product market and subtract out the amount that came in from a previous year because it wasn't produced this year. And here the change in inventories is going to be an increase, right? So if this was 100,000 in this case, 100,000 was counted as being spent everywhere else, but there was an extra 10,000 that wasn't there before, right? So we must have produced 100,000 plus 10,000. This was money that was spent, and this was some extra inventory that was produced this year. Okay? So that's what this is, the change in inventories. You'll learn more about that in accounting. But we do that with measures of how much stuff is produced, such as GDP. Okay? Okay, now, I should talk to you about, I think I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to give you an assignment, okay? Let's see. I want you to go to a place called Federal Reserve Economic Database, but you can find it just by typing in FRED. And if that doesn't give you Federal Reserve Economic Database, try FRED2, okay? And go down and look at popular series. And so what we want is real GDP, and we're going to want GDP, which would be the nominal one. And I want you to find CPI, all urban consumers, because we're going to use that in the next chapter. So, how do you get this? Because what you're going to get a chart on these. And we don't want that, we want numbers. So what you're going to do is you're going to, on the upper right-hand corner, it's going to say download, and you're going to tell it the format Excel. Okay? Now, I want you to send me a copy of the file to gsumner@utm.edu. If you're in my class. If you're just someone who's haunting around the internet, then you don't have to do the assignment. But I want you to send me a copy of the file. But I want you to print the file for class. Because when I'm talking, it'd be fun to look at some stuff together and say, what do you have there for this year and that? So print it out for yourself, but send me the file, gsumner@utm.edu, okay? And that'll be a homework assignment. All righty? So you've got something to do. I'll see you in class.